nirasya sarvasandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Śrī Govinda parāravinda marupananya vilasujjitan purna prema rasotsavo jalamano vritti prasannananan shashvat Krishna katha mahamrita payorasho mudake dato bande Bhāgavatān imān anudabam murdna nipatyakshito. Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surito Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Adadana-strinam dantair yacheham puna puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Julisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilasha Tibalashvavara Shri Rupa Chinta Malasapti Sangsto Madsvanta Durdhanta Hayetrurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shiradhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Chetasame Chittam Satam Marukari Yatupada Padme Yaram Nikilaga Sangha Shamani Shutra Tritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana-avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnava charges, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in the world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we'll discuss Padyavali. So last time we concluded the section on Bhagavan's Vatsalya, Bhagavan's affectionate protection of his Bhaktas, as shown in the case of Gajendra and Draupadi. So, segueing from that, Rupa Goswami now cites or starts a section on the greatness of Bhaktas, the greatness of those Bhaktas whom Bhagavan shows such affection for, or who inspire such affection in Bhagavan, and who meditate on Bhagavan as aforementioned. So today we'll enter into this prakaran. We'll hear a couple of, or maybe only one or two verses in this section to start. So, Atha Bhaktanam Mahatmyam. Now, the greatness of Bhaktas. Prahlāda-nārada-parāśara-puṇḍarīka Parashara-puṇḍarīka Vyāsa Ambarīṣa Śuka Śaunaka Bhīṣma Dālbhya Rukmāṅgadoddhava-vibhīṣaṇa-phālgunādīn puṇyān imān parama-bhāgavatān namāmi. I offer obeisance to these pure paramount Bhagavatas, headed by Prahlāda, Narada, Parāśara, Puṇḍarīka, Vyāsa, Ambarīṣa, Śuka, Śaunaka, Bhīṣma, Dālbhya, Rukmāṅgada, Uddhava, Vibhīṣaṇa, and Arjuna. So today we'll hear a bit about some of these Bhaktas, particularly those who are lesser known. So I'm just going to read, we'll have a few stories. So, one may wonder how the Bhaktas of Bhagavan is conveyed by the description, how the greatness of Bhaktas is conveyed by the description in this verse of one simply offering obeisance to a list of prominent Bhaktas. So the verse is by composition extremely simple. It's just a list of names and says, I give pranam to them who are pure and who are great. So there's no particular description or explanation why such Bhaktas are great. So how is it that this verse describes or conveys something of the greatness of Bhaktas? So the commentator thus explains that simply an obeisance unto them is described, because of their being possessed of greatness, and thus their greatness is established just by mention of them receiving the author's obeisance. So, who do you bow down to? You bow down to someone who has some quality, who has some greatness. So, if he's saying, I bow down to these Bhaktas, that means they're great. So, in other words, it might not be a particularly interesting poem or conveys something rich the way, this previous verse about the swiftness of Bhagavan is such a vivid, rich, poetic expression. This is, by comparison, an extremely plain statement. So the commentator is more or less saying, that's all right, don't be disappointed. The fact that he's offering obeisance to them implies that they're worthy of being bowed to. It conveys their greatness. Moreover, the Bhaktas listed in this verse are said to be pure, puṇyān. The Bhaktas listed in the verse being said to be pure indicates that they are embodiments of purity, by offering obeisance to whom purity also arises in those who offer obeisances to them. So, when someone adores what is pure, that also purifies them. Most of the Bhaktas listed in this verse are well known from the narratives about them found in Śrīmad Bhāgavatam, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and other texts. Thus, brief sketches only of the Bhaktas mentioned in the verse who are relatively little known will be offered here. So, this book is already getting long, and if we elaborate on everything, it'll get really long and difficult to finish. So things that are otherwise well known, we're going to leave out. So the character, the history of Prahlāda, Narada, Vyāsa, Uddhava, Arjuna, persons like this, which are very well known, which are documented in many places. We're not going to take the time to write out and describe all of that, although no doubt doing so would be wonderful. But you can read the Brihad Bhagavatamrita. You can read the Laghu Bhagavatamrita. You can read the places where the Goswamis and others have already done this wonderfully. So, we'll look at a few of the names, or a few of the persons here which are relatively little known. And some of them, it's hard to be 100% certain who's even being referred to. So, I've made an attempt, but I can't even guarantee necessarily that this is who was intended. So we'll look at three. We'll look at someone named Puṇḍarīka, someone named Dālbhya, and Rukmāṅgada. So the Bhakta sage named Puṇḍarīka, mentioned in this verse, may refer to a sage who once heard a voice from the sky advising him to pick lotuses and offer them to Bhagavan Vishnu. The sage accordingly collected some lotuses and eventually came to the seashore with the desire to have darshan of the form of Śrī Viṣṇu who lies in the ocean of milk, and personally offered the lotus flowers at his feet. Seeing that the ocean did not give way, he began trying to scoop the water out of the ocean with a pot, so that he could empty the ocean's basin of all its water and proceed on to Bhagavan Vishnu's abode, which he considered to be located on the far side of the ocean. Observing him sustain his effort at this for a long time, Sri Bhagavan donned the form of an elderly Brahmin and asked Pundarik to feed him. Pundarik agreed to fetch food for the Brahmana, but asked the Brahmana to continue his task of scooping the water out of the ocean in the meantime until he returned with the meal. When Pundarik eventually returned, he found not the elderly Brahmana, but Bhagavan Śrī Viṣṇu himself reclining on the seashore. Pundarik offered Sri Bhagavan the lotuses he had collected, and Sri Bhagavan offered him a boon. Pundarik requested only that Sri Bhagavan should remain there in deity form so that others may have the chance to receive his darshan and offer worship to him, just as Pundarik did. The deity of Bhagavan Vishnu that then manifested at this site, known as Mahibalapuram in present-day Tamil Nadu, is named Stalashayana, or the ground-lying Vishnu, or the Vishnu who lied on the ground. So there's still a temple of this there today. It's a bit south of Chennai. So this may be the Pundarik who's mentioned in this verse. It's hard to say for certain, but this is one such Pundarik who, is described to have had such profound devotion that Bhagavan felt compelled to appear before him to accept his offering. Okay, so now we'll come to another. The Bhakta named Dālbhya, mentioned in the verse under discussion, may refer to a sage described in the Jaiminiya Ashvamedha Parva, who resided on an island in the midst of a northern sea, which Krishna and Arjuna reached during the course of their conducting an Ashvamedha Yajna. When the horses being used for the yajna disappeared into the sea, and Krishna and Arjuna proceeded into the sea to find them. The aged sage Dālbhya, also known sometimes as Baka Dālbhya, whom they encountered on an island in the sea, was seated in meditation, holding a dry banyan leaf over his head. Evidently, he had been absorbed in meditation for a long time, as birds' nests, vines, insects, and snakes could be seen to have infested his body. When Krishna and Arjuna arrived, the sage was delighted to receive them and opened his eyes. He then recounted his life story, which spanned the vast duration of the lifetimes of 20 past Brahmas. In other words, what we call, a Mahakalpa, or one whole cycle of the universe emanating, being sustained, and dissolving, that's equivalent to the lifespan of Brahma. So to say that this sage has lived for 20 past Brahmas is to say that he's lived through 20 complete cyclic manifestations and dissolutions of a Brahmanda. So, pretty good. He's lived quite a while. And, there's a bit of intended irony here. If someone is going to stay in some place for a while, they usually make a sturdy shelter to weather the elements for their extended stay. So this sage, he's been around for 20 kalpas. So he needed a good shelter, so he opted for a banyan leaf. In other words, he didn't erect some palace or some, grand, place to keep himself, safe or free from the elements. He just put a leaf on his head. So this is meant to convey something of the austerity and the depth of vision of sages of this nature. Anyway, as the sage concluded his story, the horses emerged from the sea, and thereafter the sage departed with Krishna and Arjuna to assist as a guiding advisor in the completion of the Ashvamedha Yajna that Krishna and Arjuna were conducting. So this much can be found. Otherwise, I found one academic paper where somebody did so much research on all these Vedas and all these things about someone named Dālbhya, and it's quite spotty to find any kind of consistent narrative or to be sure exactly who's being referred to when and which Dālbhya is being talked about, and there may be multiple Dālbhyas and all of this, but I didn't, want to go into some, it would literally this like whole book on this topic, so I didn't consider it worthwhile. So this is just one such Dālbhya who may be the one referred to, or may not, but at least refers to someone named Dālbhya who had darshan of Krishna and was regarded by him as a bhakta. So now, those two are a bit, not certain. Now this, the case of Rukmāṅgada, this is clearly described in the Narad Puran. There's no ambiguity about that. And similar to the rest of the Bhaktas, the history of him is, clearly documented. So I've chosen just to document something of the narration about him, simply because it's somewhat lesser known in comparison to the rest. So this is what I've summarized from a thing that goes on for many chapters, quite a long narrative in the Narada Puran, which is as follows. Get ready for some classic Puranic drama. The Bhakta named Rukmāṅgada, mentioned in the verse under discussion, refers to a king described in Narada Purana who strictly followed the Ekadashi Vrata. The capital of Rukmāṅgada's kingdom was in Vidisha, in present-day Madhya Pradesh, but the kingdom is said to have spanned the entire earth at the time of his rule. Rukmāṅgada enforced a law throughout his kingdom that all his subjects had to follow the Ekadashi Vrata. It describes that he would every dashami, the first day of the three, because to fully follow the Ekadashi Vrata, one eats only once on dashami, fasts fully on Ekadashi, and then eats once for the sake of paran on dvadashi, and observes certain strictures throughout all 3 days. So whenever this set of 3 days would come, then it was the duty in every village or city in his kingdom that a troop of drummers would go out playing certain drums and giving the announcement that, now the vrata was starting, so that everyone was informed and was duty-bound by law to follow it. So this was the environment that he created in his kingdom. As a result, all his subjects became freed from sin, and everyone in his kingdom who died ascended to Vaikuntha. So everyone got the benefit of following Ekadashi, everyone got completely purified of all their sins, everyone performed acts of bhakti, everyone started going to Vaikuntha. Yamaraj soon observed that his court had no new arrivals, and his scribe Chitragupta found no new sins to record. They thus approached Brahmadev and expressed dismay at no longer having any purposeful function to perform. To test the devotion of Rukmāṅgada and pacify Yamaraj, Brahmadev emanated from his mind a highly seductive woman whom he named Mohini. He instructed her to entice Rukmāṅgada to marry her on the condition that he promised to do whatever she requests of him. She began singing enticingly atop Mount Mandara, where Rukmāṅgada was en route on a pilgrimage, after having entrusted the rule of his kingdom to his lone son Dharmangada. Upon seeing Mohini, Rukmāṅgada fell madly in love with her, and she proposed that they marry immediately, means the Gandharva style of the 7 types of marriage, on the condition stipulated by Brahmadev, although she obviously doesn't mention that she's been told to do this by Brahmadev, that he vow to grant her whatever she requests of him. Rukmāṅgada readily agreed. They married on the spot and returned to Rukmāṅgada's palace. Dharmangada, so you can understand, if he already has a son who's old enough to take on the rule of a kingdom, that means he's definitely been already married for a while. So Dharmāṅgada respectfully received them and made every arrangement necessary so that his father's desire to enjoy with Mohini was fulfilled. He persuaded his mother, Rukmāṅgada's chief queen Padyavali, to bear no malice towards Mohini, serve Mohini on occasion, and take pleasure in seeing that Rukmāṅgada is able to satisfy his desires with Mohini. Rukmāṅgada and Mohini then engaged uninhibitedly in romantic affairs, with the sole exception that Rukmāṅgada strictly desisted from intercourse with Mohini for 3 days during each fortnight of the month to observe the Ekadashi Vrata. So, in other words, he is still very strictly following Ekadashi, but outside of that, he's lost in the moha of Mohini. In this way, 8 years passed, until one autumn, when the time of the Kartik Vrata arrived, and Rukmāṅgada expressed to Mohini his desire to observe the Kartik Vrata that year, which would entail that they refrain from intercourse for the entire month. Mohini then understood that the time to test Rukmāṅgada had arrived. She requested him not to observe the Kartik Vrata, and instead have Padyavali observe it on his behalf. So, no, you can't observe the Kartik Vrata. Go tell your first wife to observe it for you so that you can carry on enjoying with me. A strong request. He conceded, and Padyavali is even agreeing to this, and began to observe the Vrata for the month. Then, during that month, Mohini requested Rukmāṅgada to neglect to observe the Ekadashi Vrata and instead eat on that day and enjoy with her. So Rukmāṅgada wanted to follow the full Vrata. Now she says, no, you can't follow the month of Kartik Vrata, and you can't even follow Ekadashi. Now you have to eat what's not allowed on Ekadashi and engage in activities that are not allowed on Ekadashi. Rukmāṅgada replied that he had never neglected to observe the Ekadashi Vrata throughout his entire life, and that he was determined to continue to do so. He begged her to request of him anything else. Mohini then reminded Rukmāṅgada of his promise to her as the condition of their marriage, and said that if he refuses her request and observes the Ekadashi Vrata, then she will leave him. Rukmāṅgada remained firm, however, and Mohini then angrily decided to leave. Dharmāṅgada, the son, saw Mohini leaving at this time and implored her to stay. Mohini told Dharmāṅgada that his father had broken his promise to her to fulfill whatever she requested of him, and had thus acted falsely. Without knowing the details of what Rukmāṅgada had refused to do, Dharmāṅgada then promised Mohini to do whatever is required to ensure that his father's word does not prove false. So in the spirit of virtue, I'll do whatever's needed. He doesn't know what's at stake. But now he's bound by his promise to do something about it. Mohini then led Dharmāṅgada back to Rukmāṅgada, and Rukmāṅgada explained that he had refused to neglect to observe the Ekadashi Vrata at Mohini's request. Dharmāṅgada then brought Padyavali and requested her to effect a compromise between Mohini and Rukmāṅgada, since he understood that his father will under no circumstance neglect to observe the Ekadashi Vrata. Padyavali then tried to persuade Mohini to withdraw her request and ask for anything else she so desired from her husband. Mohini then stipulated that if Rukmāṅgada will not neglect to observe the Ekadashi Vrata, then he had to chop off the head of Dharmāṅgada with a sword and place it in her lap. So either break Ekadashi or kill your son. This is her ultimatum. So this is one of these, instances of the Puranas showing, the extremes of virtue. So Padyavali accepted this and requested Rukmāṅgada to accept it also. Rukmāṅgada requested Mohini to ask for anything else instead of the death of Dharmāṅgada. Mohini said she does not want the death of Dharmāṅgada, but will only accept Rukmāṅgada's eating on Ekadashi as an alternative. In other words, she doubles down. Dharmāṅgada then, so how does the son feel about him now having to die in this case? The son, Dharmāṅgada, then drew a sword, placed it along with himself in front of the king, and requested his father to kill him, and thus uphold the truth of his word. And if you search for this online, there's a classical painting that was made in the early 20th century about this scene. Rukmāṅgada bowed down to Sri Bhagavan, though he did not see him to be present at this time. In other words, they're at this moment. Mohini is demanding, Padyavali is ready, Dharmāṅgada is holding out the sword, Rukmāṅgada raises the sword, and then before he actually does the act of killing his own son, then in his mind, he's giving his obeisance to Bhagavan, he's remembering Bhagavan. In other words, he's doing this consciously with the awareness that it's only for the sake of upholding this vrata that he observes as an act of bhakti to Bhagavan, that he feels it is virtuous in this case, for the sake of upholding that right, to kill his own son instead. So, Rukmāṅgada bowed down to Bhagavan and took up the sword. Dharmāṅgada bowed to his parents and to Sri Bhagavan, also not seeing him there, but just remembering him in his mind and bowing down and saying, okay, this is the moment of my death, let me bow to Bhagavan, let me be in remembrance of Bhagavan, and then let me die. And then extended his neck to be cut. The father, mother, and son all had expressions of peace and happiness on their faces. So because they're all thinking that this is an act of virtue, an act of bhakti, they're not upset, they're not angry or distressed about it at this time. They're going about it in a composed manner. Rukmāṅgada raised the sword, and then the earth began to quake. Waves flooded the seashore, meteors fell from the sky, heavy gusts of wind blew, and lightning strikes, lightning strikes rained down. Mohini saw that Rukmāṅgada would indeed go through with the act of killing his son, and thus lamented that her mission to induce him to eat on Ekadashi had failed. She feared the future consequences of her actions. In other words, there's no need for this extremely dharmic young prince or young king to die, so she's going to be responsible for this murder. So she's also fearing her future as a result of being, engaged here as a seductress. Rukmāṅgada then thrust the sword down towards Dharmāṅgada's neck. Now, if this were a movie, there would be a bunch of dramatic music and, some slow-mo and so on. But before the sword struck Dharmāṅgada, Bhagavan Vishnu grabbed hold of Dharmāṅgada's arm and stopped the sword. Bhagavan then proclaimed that he is highly satisfied with Rukmāṅgada, Padyavali, and Dharmāṅgada, and that they will all ascend to his abode of Vaikuntha. At the touch of Bhagavan's hand, Rukmāṅgada became completely free from all sins, as did his wife and son. All three of them then ascended to Vaikuntha. Mohini was later reduced to ashes and cursed to have no place to dwell anywhere in the universe by the chief Brahmana priest of King Rukmāṅgada, for her being the cause of the death of Rukmāṅgada, Padyavali, and Dharmāṅgada. Later, however, the Devas led by Brahma pacified the Brahmana, who consented to allow Mohini to dwell in the final phase of the Dashami Titi, and usurp the benefit produced for those who observe the Ekadashi Vrata during a time period that overlaps with the final phase of Dashami. Therefore, read your Panchika. In other words, therefore, you have to calculate the timing of the Ekadashi carefully and observe it on the right day. Otherwise, Mohini will be, getting what benefit you could, in case you're concerned about such things. Which, although, persons following the path of Uttam Bhakti are not concerned with whether they get the quote-unquote result of, the dharmic benefit of observing Ekadashi, although that's not their concern, nevertheless, they also observe the appropriate timings to do so out of attention to the Ekadashi Vrata, which is performed as an enactment of Bhakti, as per the path of Bhakti for Bhaktas who follow it. So, this is, as per the Narada Puran, something about this great Bhakta Rukmāṅgada, who's, you could say, a paragon of demonstrating nishta, or great fixity, in observance of the particular form of bhakti known as observing the Ekadashi Vrata. So, there you have it. A few stories about some of these lesser known persons described in the Puranas, but Prahlāda, Narad, Arjuna, Vibhīṣaṇa, Uddhava, etc. we'll just give pranam to them and move on. Alright, so let's look at one more verse. Next, the compiler cites a verse that describes the greatness of Bhaktas, by illustrating how particular Bhaktas attain Sri Bhagavan, by performing one of the 9 prominent limbs of bhakti described by Prahlāda Maharaj. So the famous statement in the Bhagavatam, Śravan Kirtan Vishnu Smaranam, hearing, praising, remembering, attending the feet, worshipping, offering obeisance, servitude, befriending, and offering the self. If bhakti possessed of one of these 9 characteristics shall be first directly offered to Bhagavan Vishnu, and then performed by a person, I consider that the greatest learning. So Hiranyakashipu had asked Prahlāda, what's the best thing you learned in school? And Prahlāda said, Navara Bhakti is the best thing I've learned. Although he didn't learn it in school, he learned it in the womb from Devarshi Narad. So the following verse gives an example of persons attaining success by following each of these different 9 types of bhakti. Śrī Viṣṇu śravaṇe parīkṣid abhavad vaiyāsakiḥ kirtane prahlāda-smārane tad-aṅghri-bhajane lakshmi pritu pujane akrurastabhivandane kapi-patir dāsye'tha sakhye'rjunaḥ sarvasvātma-nivedane balirabhut Krishnaptire shamparam. Parīkṣid was engaged in hearing of Śrī Viṣṇu, Śuka in praising, Prahlāda in remembering, Lakshmi in serving his feet, Pritu in ritual worship, Akrura in obeisance, Hanuman in servitude, Arjuna in friendship, and Bali in offering his wealth and self. Ultimate attainment of Krishna occurred for all of them. So this verse is cited in the Charitamrita and some other Gaudiya works. Sri Rupapada explains in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that sadhana bhakti can be successfully performed by means of observance of just one limb of bhakti, or by means of observance of numerous limbs of bhakti. Quote, that bhakti, situated in one principal limb or in multiple limbs, shall become a cause of attainment, or siddhi, meaning attaining bhava bhakti, attaining prema bhakti, as a result of fixity therein, in accord with one's own inclination, or vasana. So as per the inclination, the mental state of a particular bhakta, they may have an aptitude or a proclivity towards certain acts of bhakti more so than others. So whatsoever they're well suited to do, let them do that. Bhakti is equally present in any of these activities, so let them be engaged according to their inclination, and howsoever they may engage in such bhakti, provided they practice it and progress within it as appropriate, then they will reach siddhi, or they will achieve bhav bhakti, the object of sadhana bhakti. Sri Rupapad cites the verse under discussion in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu to illustrate the first case in which performance of just one limb of sadhana bhakti leads to attainment, or siddhi. The greatness of bhaktas is conveyed by this verse because there is mention of them achieving ultimate attainment of Krishna, which is the most exalted of all spiritual attainments. So the prakaran here is the greatness of bhaktas. So this verse usually and primarily is cited to discuss the principle that one can achieve success or siddhi by any type of bhakti, and just by any one category of bhakti. But it's cited here in this prakaran to show the greatness of bhaktas. So how is the greatness of bhaktas illustrated by the verse? Because it's mentioning bhaktas achieving, quote, the ultimate attainment of Krishna. Or in other words, bhaktas are great because they attain Krishna. They attain what is the most exalted of all spiritual objects that can be attained. In that way, the verse also conveys the greatness of bhaktas. The commentator also adds that although there are many examples of bhaktas who attain Krishna by means of servitude, dasya, Hanuman is mentioned in the verse under discussion because of his being the foremost among them, and because of the depth in his fixity in dasya bhakti being well known. From the following statement, which is found later here in Padyavali. So we'll discuss this verse more later. But Hanuman is said to say, O Lord, I do not desire that mukti destructive of the bondage of material existence, in which my awareness that you are my master and I am your servant is lost. So for me, bhakti is not a means. It's not that I accept you as my master, I serve you, and then I get paid, and then I get what I want out of the exchange. I don't want mukti or anything else that will erode this relationship between the two of us, in which you are the master and I am the servant, and I have the privilege to remain engaged in service of you. So in that way, he expresses fixity in dasya, or servitude to Bhagavan. And although it's known to many, I'll just remind that here there's a mention of both pada-sevana and dasya. So there's, quote, service to Bhagavan's feet and servitude. So there can appear to be a sense of redundance between these two things. So the commentators explain that pada-sevana means to personally attend to Bhagavan. In other words, to massage his feet or offer him incense or look after him personally, just as Lakshmi sits with Narayan and attends to him. Whereas dasya primarily refers to fulfilling orders or directions that are received from Bhagavan, such as Ram sending Hanuman to Lanka and so forth. In other words, dasya bhakti refers less so to personally serving or attending to the service in the form of the bodily requirements or pleasures of the Lord, and more so to following his directives, executing his orders, and the like. And Rupa Goswami also explains dasya bhakti to mean not only that, but even simply fostering the mentality that one is a das. That is also itself a type of bhakti, and even aptly fostering that mentality in one's mind is itself a means of achieving the ultimate attainment, as per a statement of Jiva Goswami that we discussed earlier. So, just a little recap on that distinction. Although Lakshmi, Hanuman, and Arjuna are well known to be eternal associates of Bhagavan, rather than sadhakas, and thus are not considered to have ever attained Bhagavan at a particular time, since their relationship and bhakti to Sri Bhagavan are beginninglessly existent. I should add a with there. Still, they are spoken of in this verse under discussion as having attained Bhagavan, because their examples of a deep absorption in the particular limbs of bhakti are ideal examples to follow for sadhakas seeking to attain Sri Bhagavan. So someone could object and say, oh, Lakshmi attained Narayan. What is this? We don't like this remark. Lakshmi is eternally with Narayan. She was never not with Narayan. How do you speak this way? So this is to pacify someone who may have this sensitivity and say, it's true, we're not trying to imply that she was ever without Narayan, but rather that because her service is so exemplary, she, quote, attained Krishna insofar as she exists ever in the fullness of relation and devotion to Krishna, and that is expressed through or shown in her padasevana. In that sense. So, that's all I have for today, and we can go further into this prakaran about the greatness of Bhaktas in our next reading. So, if anyone has any comments, corrections, or what have you, feel free. All right, very well. More or less some straightforward points. So we'll resume again in our next session, further into this prakaran. Vaishnavebhyo namo nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai. Thank you, Baba.